This is question 9 of the AS paper from 2017, paper 1. It's one of those questions where you look at it and think there's not much to it. In actual fact, I can actually understand how 62% of students scored 0 on one part and 0.2% of students managed to get 3 marks on part 3 of the question. Pretty staggering considering it's one of those topics that's a little bit wishy-washy that we don't particularly consider to be hardcore. First bits ask us to define each of the following terms: species and species richness. Not too much uplift from GCSE, so just pause the video and have a little think, what would you have written? Okay, so not much uplift from GCSE here. Species, organisms that are able to produce fertile offspring. Most students missed out the word fertile. And species richness is literally just the number of different species in a community. It's not proportional. Species richness, you could have just one of each species and that would make a sample seem very rich. It's not about the number of each species. Which brings us to the next point. Don't confuse species richness with a diversity index. Remember, a diversity index is a better way of measuring species richness, because species richness just tells us the number of species. It doesn't tell us the number within each species. The next bit says scientists investigated the species richness of fish caught at various depths in the Pacific Ocean close to the western coast of Chile. Figure 9 shows the scientists' results. 68% of all fish caught in this investigation came from sample A. And the question asks, what is the modal value of species richness? Stop the video and just give it a moment's thought, scribble it down in the back of your book or on a piece of paper. So I can see how many students got this wrong. Normally in AQA the question will say, use the graph above or use figure 9 or whatever. But this one doesn't. It says, what is the modal value of species richness? So many students might have thought, what does it mean by modal value of species richness? However, because they've actually written what is the value, we know that they're looking for a number. Also, if we look at the question above, it talks about define the following terms. So we know we're not looking for a definition. We are looking for the mode. We're looking for the most commonly occurring value for species richness. And if you see on the graph there, it's 5. There are 5 samples with a species richness of 5. That is all that they want us to write in there for the answer. Next part of the question, where 62% scored 0 and only 0.2% managed to get 3 marks, said 68% of all the fish caught in this investigation came from sample A. A student thought that this showed that sample A had a greater index of diversity than any of the other samples. It is not possible to draw this conclusion from the given data. Give reasons why. Pause the video and just think of 3 reasons why. You know, this is a typical question from AQA in that they don't want to know what species richness is. They don't want to know what index of diversity is. They want to know what is the difference between them. The graph has given us species richness, and they're asking us why it doesn't show index of diversity. And you'll recall from Unit 10 of the AQA book that basically species richness is about the number of different species in a sample. But it doesn't take into account the number of each species, whereas the index of diversity takes into account the number of species and the number within each species. So to answer our question, we're going to say that the number of individuals of each species is not known, and almost all of sample A could be from the same species. So what do we mean by that? Well, of our 68% of fish caught in sample A, 90% of them could have been just one species, and then the other 10% could have just been one-off of other species. So yes, they might have had the greatest number of different species in there, but 90% of them could have just been the one species with just one-offs from other species. Secondly, on the graph there, we can see that there were 2 samples caught that actually had a higher species richness than A. That means that within that catch, there were more species than were found in A. However, they had a lower number of fish. We know that because 68% of the fish was caught in A. And at this point, we flick back to the stem of the question because we're arguing that species richness is not the same as index of diversity. The final point there, which says other samples may have more individuals of each species, means that they may have had a fewer number of each species, but that the sample that was caught was representative of those species. So you might have had 4 different species in the catch, but 25%, 25%, 25 and 25%. So in a question like this, where it's clearly asking you about the difference between species richness and index of diversity, don't just throw in generic ideas about experimental design to explain why a student did not make a valid conclusion. I mean, yes, sometimes the idea of repeats or no statistical test, etc. works, but in this case, they're asking you something really, really specific. And if you're after those higher grades, rather than writing revision cards which say what is meant by species richness or index of diversity, write down questions like, what's the difference between species richness and index of diversity? What's the difference between a population and a habitat, a population and a community? Don't forget to take ownership of the question as you move through it. Underline those command words. Make sure you get a pen on that graph and you highlight the key points. I hope the video has been of use to you. Please do leave me a comment.